My name is Vanshika, and I'm the team lead of Science Communication Vertical at FAST India, or Foundation for Advancing Science and Technology. We're a non-profit organization that's working towards strengthening the scientific ecosystem in India to advance research and translation. We function across four major verticals, that is, the government, institutions, industry, and science communication. Well, we've started this podcast series on science communication to open up some very important but undone conversations around science communication, not just its status quo in India, but across the world, so that we understand where we are placed and where to head from here on. If you are a budding science communicator, this is the place to be because we'll have global science communicators come in and have candid chats with us in this podcast series. Today, we are here, we're tuned in with Deborah Blum. Deborah Blum is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist and the director of the Knight Science Journalism Program at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. She's the best-selling author of six science books, of which The Poisoner's Handbook went on to become a New York Times paperback bestseller and the subject of a PBS documentary, which was shortlisted for an Emmy Award. So, thank you, Deborah, for taking the time today to join in this conversation on science communication. We're so glad that you could make the time to be with us and have this very important conversation around science communication. Um, so, maybe let's begin with that young schoolgirl in a chemistry lab who burned her braid doing an experiment and decided she's better off writing about chemistry than being in the lab. Deborah, how did you chart a path outside of course science back in the day when science communication wasn't as well developed a concept in practice as it is today?
That's such a good question. So, yes, I started out as a science major specializing in chemistry in college, and I realized fairly quickly that I was not cut out for bench science. I was too much of a daydreamer. I was too distracted by what was going on around me. This led to a number of incidents in the laboratory at my university in which I at one point generated a toxic cloud. They had to evacuate the laboratory, and at another point set my hair on fire. And I was working away, not really looking at what I was doing, and not realizing that my braid was in a Bunsen burner. And our lab, the unfortunate graduate student who was overseeing the lab, just walked up and said, "Do you smell smoke?" And I looked down and my hair was on fire. And it was actually literally at that moment that I thought to myself, I'm a danger to myself and everyone around me in this laboratory, and I have got to do something else. And so, in a kind of uninspired way, well, slightly inspired, I worked that summer as a waitress in New York City around the corner from the Newsweek building. And I liked to write. I had worked for my high school newspaper. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll just try journalism. And I went into journalism, worked for a number of newspapers in the southern United States, which is where I'm from, and then thought, I love being a newspaper reporter, but I want to write about what I love, which is science. And so I cold quit my job. It was actually kind of scary. I just quit my job, applied to graduate school, and ended up getting a master's degree in specialized reporting with a focus on environmental toxicology, actually, at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and then went off to be a newspaper reporter in California. So your point about like this that science journalism was not an established career at that point is exactly
Right.
right. And so my first science writing newspaper job in California was at a paper in Fresno, California, in which I had been a kind of fill-in reporter while I was waiting to go to graduate school, and they hired me as the first science writer they had ever had. And that was in part because I think I was able to persuade them that science stories were essential to what they did. This was, an area that was sometimes prone to earthquakes. It was a huge agricultural area, which all kinds of different pesticides were being used. And they started recognizing, and this has been one of the themes of my life, not science journalism set off to one side and some special section for the science people around the science campfire. That's never been the audience that interests me, but the story of science is that applies to all of us in our everyday life. And so they hired me. I spent 2 years there. I was promoted, I guess you'd say, up to the larger McClatchy newspaper, the Sacramento paper, where I worked for over a decade. Wrote about ozone depletion, wrote about HIV, wrote about chronic diseases like cancer, and eventually wrote about primate research, ethical issues in primate research, which won me a Pulitzer. And so that became my first book, The Monkey Wars, which is a book about ethical issues in primate research. And the book and the Pulitzer then caused the University of Wisconsin to recruit me back as a professor of practice. And so I moved to Wisconsin, taught journalism, science journalism, narrative journalism, investigative reporting, all the things that I love. And I really do love journalism. And then I worked as a freelance journalist writing for I wrote a column for the New York Times about toxicology called Poison Pen. I did a blog for Wired about chemistry, right, called Elemental. And I continued to work on books, and started while there the series of books that I'm now completing, a trilogy of books about poison, right? The Poisoner's Handbook, which you mentioned, The Poison Squad, which is about the invention of food safety in the United States, and the book I'm working on now about female poisoners and murder in human history. The other part of that, though, is during this particular period, gradually, I think, the basic point I'm sharing with you, the idea that science is new, science and technology are some of the most powerful forces shaping the world today. If you look at the current angst over AI, that's one example of that. If you look at our semi successful efforts to control the COVID 19, we did control the COVID 19 pandemic, although that virus is still with us, or the Ebola outbreak in the DRC now. This is woven into our daily lives, and people like you and I
Right.
share that story, and it matters.
I guess like the road less taken or the road not taken led you through a very wonderful journey. So thank you for sharing some bits of that with us, and that was wonderful. So maybe we could take a leap from your younger years to discussing a bit more about the status quo of science communication as we know it. How do you think like the landscape of the field has changed over the years, specifically in your immediate circle as well as globally?
That's a excellent question, and I kind of think when I look at if there's a lesson from the way I approached science journalism, it's the lesson of taking risks on yourself. I've reinvented myself at a number of times along the way. It's really important in any career, and I think in journalism today, to be willing to take a risk on yourself, but also to do it in a way in which you're making an informed decision. So science journalism, when I was coming up, was largely centered in newspapers and then more standard models of broadcast,
Hmm.
radio and television. All of those are still around, but they look very different. And certainly, if we look in particular at the newspaper landscape, it's really
Hmm.
struggling at the moment globally. There was a period where science journalism sort of survived that. People had
Hmm.
gotten to the point, as we were discussing earlier, that they realized how important it was in an age of climate change and pandemics. And so, even when newspapers were shedding other staffers, they kept their science journalists. That we don't see happening to the same degree today.
Hmm.
So, in the modern landscape, there's a couple of things I think that are really important. I've certainly tried to adopt some of them myself, even as a longtime science journalist. One is to look at all the different ways we now can tell stories of science, right? It's both a plus. The internet has been both a blessing and a curse, as we all know, but it has given us options to tell stories in podcast form, in TikTok, and self-produced videos. And I sometimes actually do social media threads as a way of reporting a
Mm-hmm.
story I'm interested in, right? We are in a place in which we have all these different options to share the information we have.
Mm-hmm.
um, the trick is getting paid for it, obviously. So, in general, I tend to say to people, and this is something that comes out of my own career path, you want to be visible above the background noise. There's going to be a small percentage of people who get hired as staffers, and a much
Right.
larger percentage of journalists who are freelancers, which is what the modern landscape tends to look at, right? If we looked at the Washington Post in the United States as an example, they just got rid of, I want to say, 80% of their science journalists were shed in their latest. It was awful. It was a bloodbath, right?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of those guys have gone to staff positions at other papers. Some of them are building freelance careers. Some of them are writing books. But one of the things that enables you to sort of flex as the system flexes
Mm-hmm.
is to position yourself in a way in which you become known in a certain area. And I
Mm-hmm.
certainly have found that as a chemistry and toxicology writer. There are not, I love it, so that works for me, but also there's not a lot of science journalists today who really specialize in chemistry. People, don't always love chemistry the way I do. And so it's enabled me to be a very visible science writer in a certain area. And that enables me as a freelancer to attract attention, to, be able to successfully pitch to editors, and sometimes have editors come to me and ask me to do certain stories, right? So I think it's really important as we go forward as science journalists to figure out a niche, and it should be first something you like. In the idea that if you're going to spend most of your life working, as people of my class, I'm a working class journalist, right? If you're
Mm-hmm.
going to spend most of your life working, do something you like if you are able to do it. So if there's something that interests you, infectious disease like Helen Branswell at Stat or Kai Kupperschmidt at Science, right? You find that area, you become known in that area, and that allows you quite often to transcend, the sort of whims of the journalism industry. The
Right.
other option is to just be good at everything. But I like my way better.
We like it better too, Deborah. But you raised a very important point, right? About this balancing act of being broad enough to be relevant and yet having that special niche of your own, right? So that also leads me to my next question, Deborah. You also mentioned earlier on in our conversation that your journalistic reporting on the ethical issues in primate research led you towards the Pulitzer Prize,
Yes,
and more importantly, also opened a very pertinent conversation on how science doesn't only need to be simplified to be made accessible, but also raise some questions, some tough questions rather, on how it is done and what are its repercussions in the society at large, right?
yes.
So, Deborah, what are your giveaways about finding one's voice and putting pen to paper for the budding science communicators and journalists who are listening to this conversation?
So, to your point about ethical issues and covering the way science operates, science is a human enterprise, right? I feel like too often in the past we've tended not you and I, but there's been a sort of social tendency to act as if scientists are somehow, superhumans. They are smarter than
Right.
the rest of us. And a lot of them are really smart and can do things I can't do. But on the
Mhm.
other hand, I'm smart and I can do things they can't do. So I think it's really important for all of us to look at science as it is, as a human enterprise, smart people, but still people who you have egos, right?
Mhm.
Have agendas, have ambitions, make mistakes. And one of the things that we do best in science journalists, I think, is bring science home in all its full formed human dimensions. So to do
Mhm.
that, you have to have a fair amount of confidence in your ability to tell those stories and to remember. And this in part goes to my point about voice, that
Right.
we serve our audience, we don't serve science. That's not our mission as journalists. In particular, our mission in journalists is to illuminate and explain and explore and even investigate,
Mhm.
independent inquiry. But to do that, we have to have some confidence in ourselves and our ability to tell those stories. So I tend to think, as a writer, when you are thinking about your own voice, one of the things you don't want to do is, write like anyone else. It's fine to experiment with writing like other people, but you are looking for a way, going back to my standout from the background noise point, in which your
Mhm.
voice is recognizable whether your byline is on the story or not. That's the ultimate goal in finding a voice, right? This is my voice. It's different from anyone else's voice. How do I do that? How do I do that best? And some of that is, and again, I think the internet allows us to do this. We experiment some in the way that we think we can naturally tell stories best, right? When I was a blogger at Wired, I was actually writing about suspected poisonings in the Thailand area. And I wrote one piece almost entirely in second person. It was called Your Daughter Died.
Mhm.
And so I was just like, can I tell a story in second person? And then the other thing you can do as a writer is really understand the techniques of storytelling, right? We have all of these structures as narrative writers, and now I'm shifting over into narrative writing, that we employ. There are zipper narratives and braided narratives and broken line narratives, and all of these different ways that we can structure a story, and doing some planning and structuring of a story that the reader never sees is important. We get to experiment with those too, right? What structure works best? And I think, and this certainly occurred to me when I was a newspaper journalist, when I was a newspaper journalist, I was working at a paper in the capital of California in which there was very little interest in science, including among my editors. So I used to say to people, the science writer has to be the best writer on the paper, right? I have to seduce you, and good science writing to some extent can be a seduction. I have to seduce you into caring about chickens, right? I actually wrote a whole story about the personality of chickens once, or the neutral theory of molecular genetics. How do I get you there? And so, one of the wonderful things I think about being a science writer is that you get to experiment with the act of seductive writing. You figure out the way you best like to tell a story, and you lean into your strengths in the way that you tell that story. I like narrative. I like stories that have stories behind a story, right?
Mhm.
And so I tend to kind of gravitate to those narrative, ethically complicated, very human stories as a way to explore the landscape of science. And I think some of this is something you figure out as you go. Here is what my strength is. Some people are fabulous news reporters. They don't have to mess around
Right.
with complicated narratives. And what they do is equally important. But there is going to be a point in anyone's career when they recognize what they do best. And then the decision you make is to lean into that. Right.
Right. Well, Deborah, I would say that your point about the zipper narratives, it immediately took me back to the summer of 2020, 2022. That's when I had first met you, and that was at, the University of Geneva when you were imparting the summer school in science communication, and I was that young kid who might not have had those braids. I guess I was having that moment of pivot, between science and science communication, and I was so blown by the way you approached narratives, especially, over the years, of course, things have evolved. The way people are reporting and writing has also evolved, much so because of, the elephant in the room, that is AI. What are your thoughts on that, Deborah? How do you think that the voice that we talk of and often try to find in these kind of creative pursuits, is that taking a hit, or do you think it's making our research more rigorous, when we approach a story or approach science communication or any modality for that matter? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's such an interesting, and speaking of ethically complicated times, and I want to give a shout out to the University of Geneva. We met in their summer communication course, and they do a
Okay.
fabulous job. That is such a good program. Everyone should, at least at one point in their life, be exposed to a course like that. So
Absolutely.
I freelance still for the New York Times. I no longer write a column, but I freelance. I write guest essays, and I write.
Hmm.
I just did one on animal research, ethical issues in animal research, in fact, and I write book reviews.
Right.
And I think I had a book review that came out last week, and they send out on a regular basis their position on AI, which is if you use AI to write for the New York Times, they are done with you. So that's different from the research, which I'm going to address. But I think that we're going to have to get over our gee whiz, I can make this really easy for myself and have AI do it, and start
Hmm.
leaning back into the fact that we are smart, capable, talented communicators without AI. We always were, right? AI didn't change our abilities to be good communicators. And sometimes, as we see today, of course, we're in early iterations of it, right? It makes our communication worse. The programs hallucinate, they get facts wrong. I was just talking to my husband about a university graduation in the United States in which they used an AI program to introduce the students at graduation, and apparently it found a lot of the students boring and just left them out of the graduation, right? So they would walk up and their name would not be called out because the AI program had decided to skip them, right? So AI is. I want to allow that AI is, still in its developmental stage, which should make us at this moment in time extra cautious about using it.
Hmm.
I find it somewhat helpful in doing research, right?
Hmm.
And I
Absolutely.
noticed, in Google, certainly, if you go to Google and you research anything, the first thing it does is AI tells you that this is what's interesting.
Mhm.
And you have to scroll way down, sometimes to the third or fourth page, to get to the good stuff. Or you can go to another browser. Some browsers are not quite that way, and try to do that. And sometimes I'll actually compare what am I seeing on Google versus what am I doing on this seeing on this AI free browser, right? Um, so I find it helpful in kind of the summary sense, but in the in-depth sense of research, I still like to do my own work. And I was thinking about this recently, like how do we use AI in a way that is smart? There are certainly, steps, clerical steps in the process that I think AI is definitely going to become a go-to, right?
Mhm.
The creative, the talent, the voice that we've been talking about. I mean, I'm part of a lawsuit regarding the unauthorized use of my books to train large language models, right? So, do I think that eventually they'll develop, better language skills? Probably, right?
Mhm.
They'll never, this is serious, they will never be able to do what we can do as creative, inventive, and I mean inventive not in a fictional way, but as an innovative way of looking at how you tell a story, interactive way that we can do as human beings. In my the book I'm working on now, which is about female poisoners and serial killers, I let one of the sources I went to talk me into going into the base alone in the basement of his house. Right. All of my friends were like, "What were you thinking?" Right. But the fact of the matter is, I was able to use that as part of the story of I was looking at the mythology of serial killers, and I was able to use that interaction in that moment and my own fears and my
Hmm.
own emotional reaction to it as part of the way I wanted to tell that story as a narrative writer. Yes, AI can mimic some of what we do, but it will never have that spontaneous human reaction to events, and it will never be able to channel that into storytelling in the way we do. And until we have robots that can go into basements and have emotional reactions to food, we're not going to see that. So we should also, plant our feet and acknowledge that AI can do these things, but we're still a whole lot better and always will be at parts of this process.
I think that's very well put. Thanks for those thoughts, Deborah. I think, it's also about, the balancing act again that we talked of, about running with the times and also realizing, how the technology may or may not help us. I think identifying that perfect sweet spot is where we are also not denying how it can help us, but it can, you know, not overtake our voice per se. That's the point, I believe,
Right.
isn't it?
I do. I mean, it's interesting to me because there was a period as print newspapers started to decline, and they're still in many ways in decline, that my friends, I came up in print journalism, right? And many of my friends were mourning the death of journalism. And
Hmm.
I kept saying to them, and partly probably because I ended up at MIT, where you really think of technology in these sort of more embracive ways, I guess.
Right.
I said, it's not a death, it's an evolution. We're turning into something else. We're sharing
Hmm.
stories in other ways. Many, many newspapers are now entirely online. I don't know that I think that's a terrible thing. Right. I
Hmm.
mean, there are things about print that I treasure. I certainly treasure print books, but I don't know that it's not the end of journalism that journalism becomes digital. Right. And it opens up new.
Right.
So I think we have to look at AI. AI is not going to go away. I think we, are, as we always do, the next best thing where we, throw our arms around something without fully understanding its implications. We do that time and time again. We're certainly doing it with AI. I don't think
Right.
we've stopped to think about the environmental costs of AI, the water costs, the energy costs, right?
Hmm.
They're huge. And so I would like to see us be a little more methodical in the way we approach it. But going back to our what you just said in our initial conversation, it's here. It's not going to go away. So it's on
Hmm.
us to think about how we use it in a smart way. And I mean a resource smart way too. We don't want to destroy the entire earth environment with, an overabundance of data centers that drain the water and overwhelm the power grids. That would be stupid. Right? Let's not be stupid. Right. But we do want to look at AI and say realistically, in a way that allows us to keep people employed, right? How do we use the parts of this that make life easier in an intelligent way? And frankly, I would love to tell you that I think our political leaders are up to this job. I actually have no evidence that they are making these kind of decisions that if I ran the world, I would be making, right? But I think we have to keep, as citizens, pushing for intelligent management of AI and intelligent thinking about where it helps us and where it fails us.
Absolutely. I think that's very well put, Deborah, again. And AI or no AI, I guess, what's not leaving human existence is the joy of reading, the joy of stories, right?
Yes, that's right.
And coming back to your point on how printed books, right? They are never going to stop fascinating you. On those lines, maybe I could just talk a bit about what we do here at FAST. We have this very interesting science book fellowship, the India Science Book Fellowship, right? That we, have had the fortune of building from the scratch. And it really supports people who want to put science, nonfiction stories out there, make them see the light of the day. And we're creating this ecosystem around it of not just monetary support to write these books, but also the ecosystem of mentorship, the ecosystem of publishing to keep those cogs running, of what raised us through the years, the curiosity that drives scientists and science curious, people curious about science per se. So, onto with that, you know, with this fellowship, we are supporting these fellows, but I also wanted to understand your writing journey. You've been like a bestseller of six science books, and the reporting that we were talking about earlier on primate research was the starting point for your first book, The Monkey Wars, right? So what are your views on the rigor that it takes to conceptualize books, specifically nonfiction science books, and finish them as well, specifically?
Yeah, the finishing is the
The
I
finishing is the
finishing is the goal, right?
yes.
Uh, I really admire what you do at Fast in supporting writers. There's not enough programs like that, right?
Right.
And during the pandemic, we did remote fellowships, which were essentially grants to writers because we couldn't bring them to MIT. And so many writers in the United States came and wished they had something like what you do. There's so little support for writers who are working on a book, right? And to get them through to the end, as you say, because I occasionally will say to people, think very carefully because before you want to do a book, it can be a really masochistic process. It will take over your life.
Hmm.
I had a friend, Jamie Shreve, who used to be the science editor at National Geographic, and he would talk about the book monster phase, where the book takes over your entire brain and you are just a pod person, right? And I know that phase because I will be in the middle when I'm in that phase of a book. I will be talking to my husband, and I can see his lips moving, but I'm thinking to myself, wait, I know how to fix this problem in the book, right? It's like my
Hmm.
brain is just full of the book. The book, to some extent, to get to the end of the book, you have to let the book take over your life, right?
Right.
So to do a book, I think it makes a whole lot of sense to do. And we certainly do this when we're selling a nonfiction book. You work out a proposal. Some people do books on spec, but I'm of the write a proposal, get an agent, sell the book, right? Have a deadline approach is my favorite, certainly the one I've been using. And when you do the proposal, it allows you to at least start thinking about how much work is involved and what kind of work you're going to have to do. And you can lay out a kind of roadmap for where you're going to go and what you're going to do and how you're going to tell the story. I
Hmm.
had an editor at Viking who once said to me, well, a proposal is only a proposal. And that is also true. Once you get into the
Hmm.
book, a lot of times the proposal, you'll realize that you've reported past the proposal and you need to redo the books. You allow yourself to be flexible in that way. The way I tend to think about it is twofold. One is when you're writing a news story is really a sprint. You've got a short period of time and you're running to get all that information out as quickly and compactly as possible. When you write a magazine story,
Hmm.
it's a walk in the park. you're taking that core of information, but you're, describing and bringing people to life in more depth, and, giving it some narrative flow and a narrative arc, and it's going to be
Right.
longer, it's going to move slower. Books like a glacier, right? You are writing not 500 words, a standard news story, but say 100,000 or even 150,000 words, right? If you don't walk incredibly slowly in the writing of that book, you're going to finish the entire book and it's going to be 30 pages long. You have to allow yourself to find out enough information that you can bring a moment, a person, a discovery, an event fully to life in all its beautiful details. In the famous saying, God is in the details, that's what you're looking
Mm-hmm.
for. And
Mm-hmm.
so it always takes longer to do a book than you think it is going to take, right? You suddenly realize that you can't bring this moment to life unless you go to England, which I did for my Poisoner's book, right? Um, and actually are right there in the path of the murderer, right? And so you have to build that into it too, and then you have to really think. And I think this is a challenge for narrative writers. How do I bring this moment to life? What are the details I need? How much description? How little description? And at the same time, the a narrative arc is like a river. Taking your reader, you're putting them in a boat, and you're carrying them along the stream of your story, right? So how many side trips can you take, right? How many times can you go off that main narrative and explore the history of the ostrich, right? Before the reader goes, why am I reading about ostriches? I'm really done with this book, right? So you have to also know what you don't put in the book. And so I
Right.
really advise people who are doing books first to acknowledge that it's going to be way more work than they think. It's going to take
Right.
longer than they think. It's going to need, brilliant details to work. And that you need to spend a lot of time sort of plotting out in advance, right? How are you going to tell this story? What are the elements of the story? What is the narrative arc of your story? And so, having said that, I often try to discourage people. Just remember, this is going to be a lot of work. It's going to overrun your life. If you had to figure out what you were getting paid per hour working on a book, you'd have to go
Mm-hmm.
throw yourself off the top of Niagara Falls, right? But also, there's nothing like it when you pull it off. You've created a world, right? Books create a world. And to our point of places that we go and readers and love to be, a good book does exactly that. And the payoff for the writer when you can make that happen, there's nothing like it in the world.
Wow, that's like such a refreshing take on writing, Deborah, that it's kind of gotten me wanting to write something right away. So- and
Well,
all
you
these
should.
Absolutely. These were just really some very golden words and wisdom for any budding writer out there. So thank you so much, Deborah. Those were just like years of experience and love for the art talking there.
Yes.
And that also brings me to my other question about the book that you alluded to, your book that you wrote in 2010, The Poisoner's Handbook, which went on to become a New York bestseller and was also adopted as a documentary, later shortlisted for the Emmy Award. Um, what was your creative process like for the book, Deborah? Your personal one, and also the fact that it resonated so deeply, with your audience to have all these accolades, right? So, how do you go about measuring the pulse of your audience? Which this is the term that we use a lot in science journalism, right? Measuring the pulse. And yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yes. So, Poisoner's Handbook, I broke all the rules that I just laid out for doing a book. My editor, my agent said to me, don't write a proposal, right? Just write a 2 to 3 page delicious little statement about what you want to do about poison. And I thought, I'll never do this again, and I highly recommend it against it. But I thought, could I sell a book based on 2 pages? And so I actually wrote a 3 page letter to my editor, and it was about the fact that I thought poisons were amazing, and I, in fact, knew so much about them and was so interested in them that I knew that I could kill my husband and get away with it. And she bought the book
We'll
based
edit that out, no worries.
letter. And so I sold the book. I spent the first part of the advance like an idiot. And then I thought, what in the world is this book about? I can't write a book about killing my husband, right? So I literally spent several months hysterically trying to figure out what the narrative spine of that book was going to be. I knew I wanted it to be a book in which poisons were characters. That from the beginning was, I want to write a book in which it's a narrative story and some of the characters are the poisons themselves. And so if you look at Poisoner's Handbook, every chapter is about a poison and its story, in addition to the fact that it's about these two underpaid, unknown civil servants who work for the city of New York in the early 20th century, and they're trying to figure out how to catch killers. That second part was the story I didn't have. And because I was so desperate, I found these guys who had completely disappeared in the footnotes of a newsletter of the American Society of Forensic Toxicology. And that eventually led me to do all the research, including contacting their families, some of which I'm still in touch with, to be able to tell the story of Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris and this early 20th century invention of forensic toxicology, and the story of murder and the story of poisons, which are truly amazing, devious, dangerous chemical characters in that story. So I had that in my mind. I needed to find the spine of it, which I lucked in. I was more really hard work than anything else. And I had something else, going back to your point about the pulse of the audience. I'm really interested in reaching the audience that's not around the science campfire. And I thought, and I think correctly, that I could make both poisons and chemistry incredibly, I hoped, fascinating to people who had left their K-12 in the U.S. Thinking chemistry makes me feel stupid. I wanted them to see just how fascinating and amazing and dangerous and everything that it was. And that is still my target audience, right? The people who don't get that how much science matters in their lives and don't have the toolkit to make smart decisions about it. And that book really did take off. I mean, it's hard to go wrong with murder, frankly, when you're telling a story. So some of it, I think, was the true crime aspects of it. But in the
Mhm.
United States, it became a go-to book in chemistry classes in middle schools and high schools. It still is. I have ended up talking to national meetings of high school chemistry teachers about that book. I have actually given talks in prep school, middle school prep schools in the United States, right? So that part of it, the part that said, let's get that this is really cool stuff, was immediately picked up by chemistry teachers around the country, which was, I feel, is one of my best accomplishments ever as a journalist, right? Is to reach those audiences in middle school and high school. And then it became a documentary film, also called The Poisoner's Handbook. And the they got they hired Hollywood actors to play Alexander Gettler and Charles Norris, and I did not get to go, which is morally wrong, but they actually rented a wing of an abandoned psychiatric hospital in Prague so that they could recreate a 1920s laboratory. And so my
Wow.
job during the film was as a consultant. I helped them pick out the instruments, right? But they did not fly me
Amazing.
to Europe for that, so which was very tragic. Right?
Well, glad we had Geneva on board. So you had the
Yeah,
Europe trip anyway later.
that's right. So,
That's amazing, Deborah. I think I'm left with still so many questions. I want to keep probing you, but in the interest of your time and the audience's time as well, I'll start wrapping up our conversation around some other very important aspects, without discussing which I'll not be letting you go. So, one is for sure, the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship, which you have driven to immense success, right, as the director there. Um, I really wanted to understand what have been your keen observations on the people who apply, who get through, and actually leverage the fellowship, right? Because a lot of what you mentioned about, measuring the pulse of the audience and understanding what works, what doesn't, is sometimes, birthed from these kind of programs as well in really grooming people who are initiated, right? So can you walk us through like some peculiar success stories of the program, and maybe also elaborate on the need for like similar programs not just in the US but in countries like India as well?
Yes, so I was director of the Night Science Journalism program for 10 years. And I put a lot of work into. So let me just say this: the Night Science Journalism program brings 10 science journalists to. Well, 11 because we started an Africa Middle East fellowship as
Hmm.
well, but 11 science journalists from around the world to Cambridge, Massachusetts for an academic year of study at MIT and Harvard, primarily with
Hmm.
add on instruction through the program itself. And one of the things I thought from the beginning as director is, 10 people a year is great, but then we've got this amazing universe of science journalists around the world who are not going to be able to take advantage of it. So we did a lot of work to try to do outreach beyond the fellow. I'm going to come back to the fellowship, but we
Right.
ran online programs about fact checking. We ran online programs about science editing. We created a handbook for science editors that is now translated into not enough languages, but French, Spanish, Portuguese, Chinese, traditional Chinese, simplified Chinese, and Farsi, I think, and
Hmm.
German, I think, are all the different languages. And it's completely free and downloadable, right? I have a friend in Canada who is a journalist from Iran, who himself translated it into Farsi so that it could be
Wow.
distributed to people he thought could use the information. I'm really proud of that. And the fact checking programs were the programs we did. We did those under a grant from the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation. Um, and there was the one thing that when we ended that, people kept coming to us and saying, please start that up again because integrity of story is so important. So hopefully one of these days started a magazine, Undark, with the idea
Right.
that if we're going to talk about the importance of science journalism, we should actually do it right.
Hmm.
And we continued that core fellowship program. So the there are a number of factors that go into becoming a successful fellow. One is not using AI or templates in your application. I can tell you that we see a bunch of applications that are almost word for word the same. Someone went to Chat GPT and said, help me do an essay on how great science journalism is. And we would see all these identical applications once AI started coming up. I would quit reading them. As soon as I realized what it was, I'd be like, no, right. If you can't
Hmm.
take the time and trouble to write your own essay, we do not want you in this program. Right.
Hmm.
So heads up. And people would use templates that often applied to applying to graduate school. So they would come in and they'd go, and here's my research agenda, and I plan to use this in my discussion section. And I'd be like, what? Right. So you have to really, in the way we were talking about early, when you do your application, think of yourself as a independent, capable science journalist who can write their own essay and do their own research. Um, a couple other things about that application process. We really ask people, they don't always do it, to when there's a research project that's embedded into the year that you're there. Here's something that I want to study while I'm in Cambridge. And a lot of people have used that to go on and do books. Books have been published about female anatomy and pests and compounding pharmacies and climate change, all of these things coming out of a year of research during the fellowship. But you have to write a research proposal that says, and I need to come to Cambridge to do it, right? Quite often it would be, I'm really interested in the science of grasslands in my home country. And so I'm going
Hmm.
to spend an entire year looking at grasslands in sub-Saharan Africa. And to be like, really? And you have to come to Massachusetts for that because, right? And so, in the FAQ, it says, think about why you should be there. But people often don't think about how to make a compelling case that they should actually be in Cambridge.
Absolutely.
And finally, a good proposal, a good track record as a journalist, right? Good clips, decent letters. Everyone takes letters as always with a grain of salt because nobody ever asks their critics to write a letter of recommendation, right? You have to look at letters of recommendation. I look at them usually in a kind of, did this person actually know the applicant, right? We occasionally see letters that say so and so was in my class and they seemed okay. Right? And so you really want to get someone who can talk about who you are in those letters. But the other part of it is the fellowship, like I said, is about 11 people. They have to get along like a family. The fellows are your family for a year. And so we look for people who make good family, right? And in the interview, the person who comes in and says, I'm an amazing person, I'm probably a better journalist than anyone else who has applied this year. It's like that is a big red flag, right? You want
Hmm.
someone who is clearly interested in being part of a community.
Hmm.
And that's varying. I mean, the composition will change because we'll look at factors of, are we doing geographic representation and some of those other things. So, every year is a little different, but those things that I've outlined for you, I think are probably the most important elements in a general sense of a successful application to KSJ or to the Niemans at Harvard, which is another, program for journalists that takes quite a few science journalists. Um,
Right.
right. Or the Knight Wallace Fellowships at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor has often brought in environmental journalists, right? Do we need more programs like this? I think yes, because if you look at journalism per se, it's famously a profession that does very little mid career training, right?
Hmm.
You become a journalist and there you are, right? But in fact, I think after you've been in the profession for a while, these fellowship moments where you can step out and get smarter in areas that you wished you knew more about. I'm a
Right.
science writer, I wish I knew more about drought, say, right, are really important. And also, in a time that journalism does struggle, they sometimes sustain journalists to the point that they can rebuild their career. So they matter in both those ways.
That's lovely, Deborah. I really wanted to understand more of your thoughts on, bridging the gaps between countries specifically, because we talked a lot about the US, and I also know of your involvement and network so deeply with the Indian diaspora as well.
Mhm.
So, do you have thoughts on how this field has evolved in India and where we should look at? To kind of identify our North Star and then move towards that as well.
I used to say to people, I'm actually wearing a shirt from the World Conference of Science Journalists.
Yes, I see that. Yes.
Yes, which was how I ended up teaching in Geneva, in fact, right? Because that was in Switzerland. But I used to say to people when I would go to the world conferences that from a US perspective, you have to get out of the US bubble. And because we are a community of science journalists and because science is a global story, right? And the
Right.
more I would go to those meetings, the more I would see us as part of what was going on, and the interactions between different countries, including my country and other countries, as being a give and take. It's not a universal, the wisdom of the United States, which, at this particular moment in time, I don't think anyone looks at the United States to wisdom anyway, but sorry, one political statement there. But I do think that, we have had a tendency in the United States to think that we should share our wisdom with the world instead of understanding that it's a conversation in
Mhm.
which we learn about you and you learn about us and we learn from each other. That's where I think we need to go
Right.
with this. I think that's
Mhm.
absolutely essential. The continent that does that the best is not North America, but Latin America that I know. And it certainly may be doing much better in the Indian diaspora, in Southeast Asia in general, in parts of Africa. But I have long admired a project in Latin America called Stories Without Borders,
Right.
Historia San Frontera, in which journalists from different countries apply to be part of a story that clearly transcends borders, right? It was
Mhm.
COVID, it was destruction of the Amazon, transgender medicine in Latin America, different endangered species that don't stop at geographic borders. They have done this for years now, actually since the meeting in Geneva. It first started getting organized at that meeting in Switzerland and continued, or Lausanne. Um, and I wish we had more models like that,
Right.
organizations of science writers who actively reached out to science journalists in bordering countries or neighboring countries or countries in the larger diaspora of their area and said, let's look at the stories we can tell together. And not only because sometimes you do incredibly good journalism that way that you couldn't do any other way, but also because you build relationships, right, that allow you
Mhm.
to then go on and collaborate, support, engage. The Science Journalism Forum that Saad Lofty has run out of Abu Dhabi for years is, one way that we get at that in a digital sense. And I'm on the An Advisory Committee for the World Science Journalism Conference, which will be in London, I think, next year. Um,
Mhm.
and I think both of those are important in different ways. Connecting digitally is one way, connecting in person is usually the best way, right?
No,
So, or at
absolutely.
least you can build on that. So I hope to see you there, in fact.
Well, here's hoping as well.
Yes.
But this was lovely, Deborah. I think we touched upon so many important topics that usually kind of are under the rug sometimes, and we were able to kind of also excavate the kind of joys that we've always felt in thinking about stories, how to write them, how to move the audience with it. So this was so lovely. Do you have any final thoughts, Deborah, on one important thing that I have, whenever I've read your work, I've often contemplated about that is about misinformation, right, and how science journalism tackles it. Do you have any final thoughts on how important that is as science communicators and journalists to really, pinpoint that?
Yes, I think we've seen, and it certainly preceded the COVID-19 pandemic, but the COVID-19 pandemic crystallized it.
Hmm.
The use of misinformation or deliberately misstating what a scientist is or what the goals of science is, has been able to do active harm. And, in the years since the pandemic, I'm thinking about the anti-vax movement at the
Right.
moment. People have died because of that, right? They don't recognize the deaths necessarily, but in fact, many people have died unnecessarily. And as a science journalist, I keep saying to people, we do not want to go back to the 19th century, right? The
Right.
19th century was not a model of public health in any way. And we need, as science journalists, because our job is to share accurate information with the public, and emphasis
Hmm.
on accurate there, right? Um, I think we need, as science journalists, to recognize that that is increasingly one aspect of what we do, and to figure out ways to do it as well as possible. It is a daunting task. Sometimes it feels like the famous biblical analogy of David and Goliath, where, these
Hmm.
little guys with slingshots and misinformation is this giant monster of a thing. And people I know who have studied it, often come away really frustrated, in that, we don't have some magic answer to this. At this point, I think it's important for us to do our very best to get out information that is as accurate as possible, so that people can't come back and say, oh, well, that was wrong. I think
Right.
it's important for us to get it out repeatedly. One of the things we've learned about misinformers is that they do it repeatedly, and they'll take one fact and twist it in multiple ways, different times, so that it always seems like a new bad piece of information. Our job is not to quit. Our job is to continue to get good information out there, right? And going back to the point of audience that has kind of run through our conversation, as it should, our
Mhm.
job is also to think about the people who actually are inhaling this information and acting upon it, and
Right.
think in ways that I don't know that we've entirely figured out yet. How do we reach them, right? You don't have to persuade me to get vaccinated, right? But there are people out there that you might want to persuade who are very resistant to that information. So we, as journalists, really think about how do we reach that target audience. And, that's a quest that may well last us a lifetime, but I hope we'll eventually get there.
That was a perfect close to our conversation, Deborah. I think this has been nothing short of like illuminating in so many ways. Just so many fresh perspectives on, what we do on the daily, and just having these, these nuggets of wisdom from you has been very, very gratifying. Thank you so much, Deborah, for your time and for all that you offered through this conversation for everybody listening. Thank you so much. It was lovely
Thank
having you.
you in return. It was totally a pleasure. You asked such amazing questions and pushed me to think in all kinds of ways that I haven't always thought, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you, Deborah.